Hey gang, welcome back to Therapeutic Window. I'm Pat Sharp, and today we're going to be talking about cancer immunotherapy. And in particular, we're going to focus on a wildly successful anti-cancer immunotherapy from Merck called Keytruda. We're going to have a look at how this is really transforming the treatment paradigm for cancer, but also dive into the background of its discovery and development, because it happened in a way that you probably didn't expect. So before we start today, a bit of context and a disclosure. So one of my family members, Colin, is currently undergoing immunotherapy treatment for squamous cell carcinoma. So I'm hoping that the information here is, helpful for him and for the family and for other people in similar situations. And the disclosure is that I actually am a former scientist at Merck. I worked there for a few years between 2017 and 2021. I used to have stock in Merck. But I've since left Merck, and I also sold all my stock in Merck, so I have no real financial gain from any success of Keytruda or immunotherapy. So Keytruda is the brand name of pembrolizumab, also known as Pembro for short. It's a monoclonal antibody, which means it's a biologic, and it's immunotherapy, which means it's a drug that helps your own body's immune system identify and target cancer for destruction. So Keytruda is a phenomenally successful cancer drug. It's really probably the most innovative new cancer therapy that's emerged in the last couple of decades, and it's now been approved for almost 20 different types of cancer, but it's been especially promising for treating melanoma and non-small cell lung cancer. For example, in clinical trials of advanced metastatic melanoma, which is a particularly aggressive form of cancer, 33% of patients on Keytruda had their tumours shrink or disappear, and that was compared with about 11% with the next best immunotherapy, ipilimumab. And in a clinical trial for high-risk stage 2 melanoma patients after surgery, Keytruda reduced the risk of cancer recurrence and death by about 35% compared with placebo. And after a year of treatment, just less than 10% of Keytruda patients had their cancer progress, which compares to 17% of the placebo group. So looking at data for squamous cell carcinoma, which is more relevant to Colin's situation, in a recent Keynote 629 phase 2 clinical trial, Pembro showed really effective antitumor activity in squamous cell carcinoma. It gave really clinically meaningful and durable responses, meaning that as the tumors were regressing, as they were shrinking, they weren't coming back. And it also showed a pretty acceptable safety profile, particularly in elderly patients who are often the ones presenting with recurrent metastatic squamous cell carcinoma. But in this situation, Colin isn't actually receiving Keytruda. He's receiving a version of the same monoclonal antibody but developed by Sanofi and Regeneron, and this version is called Libtayo, also called cemiplimab. So looking at cemiplimab specifically, in an open-label phase 2 single-arm clinical trial which looked at treating locally advanced cutaneous squamous cell carcinoma in 78 patients, an objective response was observed in 34 patients, or 44%, and complete responses were seen in 10 patients, or 13%, and partial responses were seen in 24 patients, or 31%. And in addition to that, what some of these statistics really don't convey effectively is that for 20 or 30% of patients that respond to immunotherapy like Keytruda, the majority don't have their cancer return. And this is because the body's own immune system has now been trained or primed to detect this form of cancer when it arises and to be able to destroy it effectively. And so this can act essentially as an effective cure for cancer for these patients in some cases. What is actually surprising is that the idea of immunotherapy has actually been around for a very long time, going back almost 100 years when physicians first observed the fact that some cancer patients could sometimes essentially be cured from their cancer if they were infected by viruses at the same time. And the reason that this occurs is because during an infection, the body's immune system becomes highly primed and it's on high alert for problems and can start to detect defects in cancer cells and then target them for destruction. So under normal conditions, the immune system has a lot of checks and balances in place to make sure that it doesn't start attacking the body's own cells indiscriminately. And these are called immune checkpoints. So what these new immunotherapy drugs do is they block these checkpoints and enhance the immune system so it'll begin to recognize cancerous cells. So these drugs can also give rise to autoimmune side effects, like for example lupus, but if you're suffering from cancer, that's probably a tolerable trade-off. And so based on this understanding of how these checkpoints in the immune system works, You've probably assumed that these drugs were discovered by pharmaceutical companies using this understanding to identify immune checkpoints and target them to develop specific drugs that block them. But this actually isn't the way that Keytruda was discovered. In fact, it all actually started at MIT with a PhD student. In 1990, Greg Carvin was working in the lab of Professor Peter Stern. He was a structural biochemist and he was trying to crystallize an immune protein called HLA-DR1 to work out what its structure was. And unfortunately for him, someone else was working in this area too, and before he had got to figure out the structure of HLA-DR1, this other research team had beat him to the punch, which caused him to really change his research directory and try a different project. So he started learning how to make really specific antibodies to try and understand the function of HLA-DR1 instead. So eventually Greg Carvin became a really good antibody biochemist. And after he graduated, he first started working at a cancer startup biotech company in Massachusetts, but that quickly failed. So then in 2005, he joined another biotech company called Organon. And this was a Dutch biotech company that had just set up a new research site in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they were focused on developing new antibody therapeutics, so right up Carvin's alley. So at Organon, Carvin's team was really trying to find antibodies that could activate the PD-1 protein and suppress the immune system for treating autoimmune diseases. But instead what they found was the proteins that they made actually blocked the PD-1 signaling. So instead of just being really disappointed with this result and just trying again to make an activating antibody, which is probably what a big pharma research team would do because they have specific processes they have to follow and they have very specific milestones they have to meet, Carvin actually sat back and thought to himself, well, what else could we use this antibody for? And this is exactly the type of attitude that leads to breakthroughs in medical innovation. Now, at the time, cancer immunotherapy was actually still quite a niche field. And although there was data from the virally infected cancer patients was well known, most scientists and physicians thought that this wouldn't be a viable strategy for treating cancer generally. But Carvin's team at Organon really recognized the potential of their PD-1 blocking antibodies and started to do experiments to demonstrate their effectiveness as anti-cancer agents. But just 2 years later, in 2007, Schering-Plough acquired Organon for $14 billion. And this acquisition wasn't to get a hold of Pembro. In fact, pembrolizumab was quite a deprioritized program at Schering-Plough. Really, the acquisition was to generally expand their product pipeline and try and strengthen their R&D capabilities. So nothing really happened with pembrolizumab at Schering-Plough, but then another 2 years after that, in 2009, Merck acquired Schering-Plough for now $41 billion. But again, this wasn't to acquire pembrolizumab as an asset. In fact, the reason they brought Schering-Plough was to really strengthen and deepen their global presence. Schering-Plough generated about 70% of its sales outside the US, and Merck wanted to get access to that. But additionally, Merck also wanted to try and expand its product pipeline because some of its blockbuster drugs like Fosamax and Singulair were about to come off patent, and Schering offered successful brand name drugs with longer patent lives like Nasonex, for example. Even at Merck, though, the pembrolizumab program was deprioritized, and it was nearly dropped until some promising data from BMS on their competing PD-1 drug called Opdivo really motivated a serious reconsideration. And it was Roger Perlmutter, who at the time was head of Merck's R&D labs, who really recognized Keytruda's exceptional potential, and he directed immense resources towards development. So he pushed for a really aggressive clinical strategy, rapidly expanding trials across multiple cancer types simultaneously, and famously telling staff, "Stop what you're doing now, we've got to do this." Peter Kim was also a key player in the development of Keytruda at Merck, and he was head of Merck's antibody and protein biotherapeutics discovery and development team. He was the one who initiated the rapid clinical trials which ultimately led to the light-speed development of Pembro. So just a year later, in 2010, Merck filed their investigation on new drug application with the FDA, and then a year later than that, in 2011, the pioneering phase 1 Keynote-001 trial was underway. And the data from the Keynote-001 trial showed really durable anti-tumor responses and an excellent safety profile. And these findings were pivotal. They suggested that Pembro had significant potential for treating both melanoma and non-small cell lung cancer and other solid tumors. In 2013, this potential was recognized by the FDA, and they granted pembrolizumab with breakthrough therapy designation for advanced melanoma. And what this means is that it could be fast-tracked for clinical development and a regulatory review, and that's exactly what happened. So in 2014, so this is 4 years after the acquisition, Pembro was approved to treat advanced melanoma in patients who had not responded to other therapies, and this approval was historic. It was the first time an anti-PD-1 therapy was approved in the US, and it was a major milestone underscoring the promise of cancer immunotherapy. And this set the stage for Keytruda's ultimate adoption across multiple different cancer types, really transforming the oncology treatment landscape. It became Merck's flagship drug, it became Merck's best-selling drug, and in 2023 it was actually the best-selling drug in the world, and it accrued more than $23 billion in sales. So the discovery of one of the most successful and transformative cancer drugs at all time wasn't the result of a big pharmaceuticals process from start to finish. In fact, it didn't even happen at a big pharmaceutical company at all. It happened at a small biotech company and was a product of several chance observations, near misses, and risky decisions by key individuals that all needed to come together to bring this drug into the world. And many, if not most of the important medicines around today have really similar origin stories. And I think this really highlights the difficulty in developing medicines and the really important role that keen individual scientists and small biotechnology companies play in driving medical innovation. And if it wasn't for people like Greg Carvin and his perspective on a failed autoimmune antibody, there may be many cancer patients who wouldn't be alive today. So another interesting twist to this story, as I write this, a pair of pharmaceutical companies, Summit and Akeso, have collaborated to release data on a new PD-1 VEGF bispecific antibody called ipilimumab to compete with Keytruda. It targets the same immune checkpoint as Keytruda does, PD-1, but it also targets a second cancer-driving protein called VEGF. And in a really recent clinical trial in non-small cell lung cancer, it appears to have shown a better progression-free survival. Since the trial was run in China, it might take the US regulators a bit more data to convince them to approve a drug like this, but I still think this is really promising, and that drugs like this have the ability to continue to push the boundaries of cancer therapy. So I hope you found this story of Keytruda and immunotherapy useful. And as always, stay informed, stay engaged, stay curious, and until next time, this is Pat Sharp signing off.